to get started. My name is Mauricio Font, and I'm professor of sociology at Cubans College and the Graduate Center. I'm also director of the Gilmer Center. It's a great honor to collaborate with sociology, the PhD program in sociology, and the program on a seminar on migration studies, something like that.
Something like that.
In sponsoring this great event. I mean, people will be coming in, we have plenty of chairs, but it's a truly great honor to welcome Alejandro Portes, who will be speaking about the very distinctive, even peculiar, as it says, this is economic evolution of the Cuban American community population in the United States. We'll ask Phil Kasnitz to introduce Alejandro Portes, give you a little bit more background information on him. Phil is a professor of sociology, distinguished in many areas of inquiry, including migration studies, and he is the upcoming, or he will be next year, or at least next semester, the executive officer in sociology, in the PhD program in sociology. It's a great honor to have him, an expert in this field, to introduce Alejandro Portes. So you're well welcome, Phil.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a great honor to welcome Alejandro Portes back to the Graduate Center. For those of you who don't know, Professor Portes is the Howard Harrison and Gabriel Snyder Beck Professor of Sociology at Princeton, the Director of the Center for Migration and Development Studies at Princeton, and starting next year also becomes a professor simultaneously at the University of Miami, correct?
Yes.
Very good. And there's so many things one could say about Professor Portes, who is probably the best known migration scholar in the country today, almost certainly the most influential. I would just point out a few small facts. He was in 1998 the president of the American Sociological Association. And since 2003, he's been a member of the National Academy of Sciences. But I just recently learned, thanks to Mauricio's Googling skills, that Professor Portes is, at the moment, the most cited living sociologist in the world. He is actually only the 10th most cited sociologist, but the other 9 guys are dead. Which I think is a much better thing to be, actually. So that puts him among the living in extraordinarily fine company, and even among everybody in pretty fine company. So with that, it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Portes back to the Graduate Center.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be back here. I think that it's about my 3rd lecture at the Graduate Center, either sponsored by the Sociology Department or, in this case, the Billner Center, in this pretty snowy day that may augur tough times tomorrow. But here we are today, and I am delighted to share the results of my most recent study on this issue of what has happened to the Cuban American population of the United States, a topic that is, of course, of personal interest to me, being a Cuban American myself, but also I think of general interest because of the theoretical importance that what happened in Miami in the 60s and 70s had for the study of immigration, and that garnered great deal of attention, in a sense disproportionate to the size of the group, because of the construction at that time of a vibrant enclave economy in South Florida that, in a sense, ushered and gave opportunities to third-generation immigrants and their children to move up and away in the American economy and society. So without that is, in order to get this on the road, let me mention that successive phases of the Cuban exodus up to 1980 have been traced numerous times in the literature. This literature came to an end with the Mariel exodus of 1980 that marked really a point of inflection in the development of this community. and on the economic enclave that had been built beforehand. The Mariel episode and its consequences have also been told many times. They are a well-known story, even in the popular literature. But for my purposes in this talk, Mariel produced two major consequences. First, it shifted what we call the mode of incorporation of new Cuban arrivals in the United States from positive to negative. President Carter's declaration that the United States would continue to receive all new Cuban escapees with open arms back in 1980 represented the last gasp of the previously benign policy of unrestricted admission of Cubans by the US government. Realities on the ground proved too much, and the official attitude shifted toward denying the Mariel arrivals permanent settlement. Instead, a raw and more ominous legal category was invented for them at that time: entrance status pending. The image that Cubans had carved in American public opinion also suffered a marked deterioration. The exiles ceased to be a model minority and, quote, the builders of the new Miami, to become just another third world minority forcing its ways into American shores. In public opinions that were taken at that time and that we reported in the book City on the Edge back in the early 90s, Cubans ranked last, among the least popular groups in the country after Mariel. That abrupt change in their public image was one, but not the only reason why the old-style exile community also shifted its stance from welcoming the new arrivals to creating social distance from them. The derogatory term Marielito made its appearance about that time, that is late in 1980. For displaced pre-revolutionary Cuban elites whose sole sort of comfort in exile had been its cozy relationship with Washington and the welcoming attitude of the American public, the stigma brought about by Mariel became nearly unbearable. The successful anti-bilingual referendum held in Miami-Dade County in the same year, 1980, came as the last straw. These events marked the beginnings of the bifurcation of the Cuban expatriate community into two distinct groups with significant consequences for the future. In 1980, and even after Mariel, Cubans in the United States represented an elite group with average levels of education, occupational status, and self-employment comparable or superior to the American population and certainly above other Latin immigrant groups. Their gradual transformation into another third world minority was not inevitable. It happened instead as a consequence of that momentous split of 1980. The successive phases of this transformation and its complex effects both for the Cuban American community and for its relations with the government in the island is the story that I am going to try to trace for you in this talk. First, the reaction of the old Cuban upper middle classes to the anti-bilingual referendum and the stigma of Mariel took two forms. First, there was a political shift from an exclusive concern to overthrowing the Castro regime in Cuba toward domestic mobilizations in self-defense. And second, there was a closing of the networks of the old enclaves to the new arrivals, that is, the Mariels and post-Mariel refugees. Following the events of 1980, Cuban business people in Miami who had believed themselves integrated into the Anglo-American mainstream began to withdraw from its organizations and to create parallel ethnic associations. Groups like Facts About Cuban Exiles, or FACE, and the Cuban American National Foundation were founded at that time. Plans were made to run candidates for local office. And more importantly, a new discourse began to emerge portraying the exile community itself as a solution to Miami's problems rather than the problem itself. And this is what now the late banker Luis Botifol, one of the leaders of that community in the 1980s, had to say. I won't read it, you can read it yourself. It's cited in my book with Alex Stepik, City on the Edge. And it's worth reading because what it says is that we are not another downtrodden group. In a sense, we lay claim to Miami. That is, we have been the ones who, in a sense, transformed the city into what it is. Before the Great Change, it was just a tourist resort for all people. But now we came and something was due to us, that it can be. So this citation from Botifol exemplifies what was known at the time as the Cuban success story in the United States. That's evident in that statement, but what is neglected in it is its reactive character. It was created in reaction to the anti-bilingual referendum and to the very negative image following Mariel. The anti-bilingual referendum could be interpreted as an attempt by the local English-speaking elites and the native population in South Florida to put the Cubans in their place. Instead, the old exiles reacted by mobilizing what were already considerable economic power and collective solidarity, putting them at the service of domestic electoral politics in South Florida. And with good results. By the mid-1980s, the mayors of the cities of Miami, Hialeah, West Miami, and several smaller municipalities in Dade County were Cuban-born. And there were 10 Cuban Americans in the Florida state legislature. The 1990s added 3 federal congresspeople, and the 2000s, 2 federal senators, that is from Florida, first Mel Martinez, and now the incumbent Marco Rubio. So even today, in areas of Latin concentration in this part of the country, it's scarcely worthwhile to run for electoral office if you are not Cuban American. The Miami congressional delegation registered several notable successes, primarily in the form of successive laws tightening the economic embargo against Cuba, but also others benefiting their own community. The Cuban Adjustment Act, which was passed in 1966 in the context of the Cold War, granted Cuban refugees and their king expedited access to US legal permanent residence outside of quota limits and other legal qualifications. The waiting period for a permanent residence for Cubans who arrive in the United States was shortened from 2 years to only 1 in 1976. And the law was kept in the book with the support of the Cuban American congressional delegation, in combination with the immigration agreement between the US and Cuban governments following the rafters crisis in 1994, granted Cuban citizens arriving in American shores near automatic asylum, followed by a fast-track process toward permanent residence and citizenship, unique among all foreign minorities arriving in the country. The only one that was granted this kind of privilege at that time. A fundamental but commonly forgotten aspect of this story of political mobilization is that successful mobilization involved the older exiles, the cohorts that arrived in the 1960s and 1970s, and eventually their children, the second generation, but largely excluded the Mariel entrants and subsequent arrivals. These later refugees that settled mainly in the poorer areas of metropolitan Miami, like the working class city of Hialeah, were not the beneficiaries of the networks of solidarity that had allowed the earlier cohorts of exiles to find jobs in Cuban Enclave firms, move ahead economically, and eventually become entrepreneurs themselves and send their children to the university. For example, the so-called character loans that were given to earlier Cuban entrepreneurs without collateral by Cuban bank officials solely on the basis of their known character became unavailable to Mariel and post-Mariel arrivals. Other forms of co-ethnic solidarity were also withdrawn. From the point of view of the earlier established exiles, Mariel and post-Mariel arrivals were different. They were raised under the revolution. They lacked the work ethic and the principal anti-communist political stance of the earlier waves. In other words, from the perspective of many of the older exiles, the new arrivals could not be trusted. This is what a social worker interviewed by us in Miami in the early 90s have to say. You can read it, I don't have to repeat it, but you can see there what kind of views were depicted in that sense of that kind of fragmentation. This citation, I think, illustrates fairly well what was going on at that time. The quasi-automatic The quasi-automatic granting of asylum the quasi-automatic granting of asylum to new given by the Cuban Adjustment Act and the closure of the Enclave to new arrivals, in essence, worked at cross purposes. They were contradictory in their results. The quasi-automatic granting of asylum and the Cuban Adjustment Act facilitated a continuous stream of new refugees from the island. But the closure of the Enclave excluded them from the networks of co-ethnic solidarity that had been fundamental in economic mobility for the pre-1980 exiled communities. And consequences of this contradiction started to appear in the early census statistics as early as 2000, as we are going to see. Later. The Mariel Exodus was seen as a catastrophe. Let's talk a bit about the relationship, these peculiar paths there in the Straits of Florida between the U.S. and Cuban government, and of course the exile community. The Mariel Exodus was seen as a catastrophe in Miami, but it was a political triumph for the Cuban government that in one fell swoop erased the negative image linked to the occupation of the Peruvian embassy in Havana, got rid of common prisoners and other undesirables, and in turn stigmatized the Cuban population, the expatriate population living abroad. The use of the strategies of free departure had been used repeatedly by Cuban authorities as a temporary safety valve to reduce internal opposition, open a port and let people go for a while. But what changed with Mariel, this has been done several times before, but what changed with Mariel was the stance of the American government. While the Cuban Adjustment Act remained in force, thanks in part to the growing political power of the old exiles, new refugees from the islands were neither promoted nor welcomed anymore. Hence, the positive context of reception that had greeted earlier exiles in South Florida disappeared. Post-1980 refugees had to fend for themselves, settling in poorer areas of South Florida while maintaining ties with their kin and friends in the island for emotional support. This shift in the U.S. stance toward Cuban and Cuban migration was made evident during the Rafters crisis of 1994, during which the escapees risking their lives in the Straits of Florida were not welcome in American shores. Instead, they were taken to the American base in Guantanamo and to a limbo of indefinite detention. The obvious intent of taking these escapees to Guantanamo was to discourage new attempts at crossing. The governmental agreement that eventually ended this crisis created a program of orderly departures from the island, a lottery bringing in about 20,000 a year, not because of an official desire by the US authorities for fresh refugees, but basically as a way of preventing new and cataclysmic episodes at sea, like the Rafters crisis of 1994. Let me leave that there for a second, because I'm missing a few slides. But actually, what I wanted to point out is the negative mode of incorporation of post-1980 refugees encouraged their continuous ties with those left behind in the island for emotional support. In other words, after 1980, the new arrivals may not be very popular with established exiles in Miami, which has sort of set them apart, but they were so with their acquaintances back home that increasingly came to depend on the refugees for economic support. The families left behind were the beneficiaries of a continuous flow of resources that in the impoverished conditions of Cuba became decisive for survival. From their meager South Florida salaries, the new refugees managed to send back enough money and goods to keep their families alive. Hence, a new phase of the Cuban-US saga, which is now more than a half-century old, was inaugurated with the return trips of the new refugees, a movement that consolidated despite every attempt by the all-exile leadership, the Cuban-American political leadership in Miami, to set it back. Migration from Cuba thereafter became a two-way movement rather than a one-way escape from political oppression, as had been earlier on. At some point, it dawned on the Cuban authorities that the escapees, rather than a threat, had become a valuable resource. The close historical ties between Cuba and the United States were effectively eliminated by the advent of the revolution. Thereafter, only a few brave souls dared to go back after being granted asylum in America after escaping. It was, in the novelist Guillermo Cabrera Infante's words, a world in black and white, where the frontal confrontation between the revolutionaries in the islands and the old Cuban upper middle classes left little space for dialogue, much less for regular visits. In subsequent years, political extremists on both sides of the Florida Strait in a sense supported each other, as the Cuban revolutionaries based their claim for political legitimacy on their struggle against Yankee imperialism, spearheaded by the so-called Miami Mafia, and the old exiles in Miami, conversely, consolidated their political position in South Florida on the basis of their intransigent anti-communism and the block voting that it brought about. With the advent of new communications and transportation technologies, other immigrant groups, both in the United States and Western Europe, have proceeded to build dense transnational networks with their home countries. They have transferred economic resources, know-how, and cultural innovation back home, and have received in turn the affection and respect of kin and local communities, and eventually the recognition of the home country governments for the contributions. Cubans remain apart. The exiles of the 1960s and 70s would not partake of these practices, and those who dare break ranks were ostracized, if not physically attacked. Former upper and middle class Cubans made a point of honor not to return to the island while Fidel Castro was still in power, and not to contribute a single dollar to the support of the regime in that case. So in that situation, Cuban transnationalism was rescinded back in the 60s and 70s. But the aftermath of Mariel started to change that situation, as the new refugees saw their departure from Cuba at more, not so much as a principled escape from oppression, as an economic strategy in behalf of their family and kin. Militant anti-communism declined among the new arrivals, and family solidarity took its place. Discreetly, the new refugees found ways of sending money and goods to their kin and friends, and to return the island to enjoy the recognition garnered by their generosity. Their outlook and behavior did not differ much from what other Latin American immigrant groups were doing in the United States, what Nicaraguans and Mexicans and Salvadorians were doing, but they were quite different from what they were doing before. So what happened then is that with time, as time passed and with growing numbers, Cuban transnationalism was effectively reborn by this new group. It emerged in a bifurcated context, where the older, richer, and more politically connected segment of the community disapprove of these practices and try to stop them. So the question arises why they did not stop them. That is, why did not the two segments of this community that was increasingly bifurcated did not come to blows with each other? That's a complex question, and I don't have time to get into the details, but I think that there are two aspects that were very important. First was the original withdrawal of support and assistance to the new arrivals by the old style Cuban community. So if that is with that withdrawal, they lost any moral authority to lecture the newcomers about what they had to do, since they had not received any particular great assistance from their co-ethnics earlier on to move on. There was no reason, there was no moral stance to lecture them about what to do. And the second reason is that what the new exiles, post-Mariel and so on, were doing was perfectly in keeping with the family values of all Cuban society, in which the support of the family was a paramount value. So it was one thing for the Cuban-American political machine in Miami to stop foreign merchant vessels to arrive in the port of Havana through punitive measures, and there was another to go after their own compatriots who were simply trying to keep their families alive at home. That was very difficult to do, and it was not done. That is, despite the disapproval and attempts, that could not be done because it ran against the value system of the very society that they were trying to defend. The US federal government tacitly collaborated in the reemergence of Cuban transnationalism in various ways. First, the Cuban Adjustment Act was not repealed. It was kept in the books and continued to grant Cubans to this day who set foot on American shores quasi-automatic asylum. Second, the American government did not persecute too vigorously those who returned to the island or the commercial agencies that organized trips to Cuba. Even at the height of the repressive period during the second Bush administration, recently arrived refugees continued sending remittances home and traveling to Cuba through third countries. Penalties for doing so were exceptional and were all but eliminated with the advent of the Obama administration. The effect of these US policies was to allow, unwittingly or not, the emergence of a new and dense traffic across the Straits of Florida and a growing dependence of Cuban families back in the island on the generosity of their expatriates, mostly in South Florida. And the final phase of this story that I have tried to trace quickly for you began when the Cuban government gained full consciousness of what was taking place and began to actively promote rather than just to allow the departures. For many years beforehand, the Cuban government had been selling the services of doctors, physical education instructors, and musicians to other countries. The idea, however, that the mass of the refugees abroad, especially in the United States, could become a significant economic resource took hold only gradually in the Cuban leadership. This new phase culminated in the decision of the Cuban government in 2012 to grant passports to anyone wishing to leave the country and to extend the period of legal residence abroad to 2 years, which is not coincidentally about the time it would take a newly arrived Cuban refugee in the United States to gain legal residence. So that was factored in by the Cuban government in knowledge was to get legal residence so that they could continue traveling legally to the island, bringing remittances and other things. So intentionally or not, the likely result of this new policy has been to transform the Cuban population of the United States so that the presence and the voice of the all anti-communist elites and cadres has been greatly reduced. So the former black and white world of Cabrera Infante has ceded place to a new sort of grayish world where the expatriate community effectively functions increasingly as an important source of macroeconomic stability for the now very old regime in the island. The Cuban-American political machine in Miami has not become entirely toothless, however. While trips across the Strait of Florida were tacitly tolerated when they involved a few thousand individuals, a new wave of tens of thousands of newly minted refugees with minds bent on sending remittances at home is likely to trigger increasing opposition. Already, the most prominent Cuban-American politician, Senator Marco Rubio, everybody knows, has spoken publicly about the need to end the Cuban Adjustment Act. To put it an end, and that is, he very graphically said, those who are coming here are not refugees anymore. They travel 5-10 times to Cuba every day. What kind of refugees are they? So they actually are. That is, despite everything, there is a move afoot from the Cuban-American leadership to end this sort of privilege that was a product of the Cold War back in the 1960s. So all of this is generally well known. What I wanted to share with you next is some data about the economic effects of the story that I have told you and how it has impacted the Cuban-American population of the United States. Cuban-owned firms in Miami, in the United States, grew nationwide from an estimated less than 1,000 in 1967 to about 37,000 in 1982 and above 61,000 in 1987. Most were located in metropolitan Miami, where 75% of the Cuban origin population concentrated. Cubans being the most concentrated of all major immigrant groups, that is foreign origin groups, in the United States for decades. Although many of these enterprises were small, their aggregate receipts back in the late 1980s reached about $3.8 billion in 1987, a figure that exceeded by 400 million that of second-ranked Los Angeles, and was 3 times that of third-ranked New York, despite the fact that these cities, Los Angeles and New York, had much larger Hispanic populations than Miami. By 2000, the US national rate of self-employment per 1,000 population was 93.5. For Cubans, it had reached 127.3. By 2001, there were over 125,000 Cuban-owned firms in the United States, with gross receipts of over $26 billion of 2000. Most of them, again, most of these firms concentrated in the Miami-Fort Lauderdale metropolitan area. These unrelated figures that have been published earlier on attest to the economic dynamism created by the Cuban enclave since its origins back in the 60s and 70s. But then something worrisome started to happen. In 1979, Cuban families in the United States had median household incomes of over $16,000 in 1978 dollars, a figure that was at par with the American population as a whole. By 1989, the median household income of the Cuban population had increased to over $27,000, but that was $3,000 below the national median in that year. And the poverty rate for the year was 14.7% for Cubans, a figure well below than that for the Mexican population, the largest Hispanic minority in the country, but 2% above the national average. By 1999, median Cuban household incomes had reached over $40,000. That looks impressive on the numbers, but notice that the figure was 10,000 below that for the native-born population as a whole, and was more than 3,000 below that of the Colombian immigrant population at that time. The Cuban poverty rate had crept to 18.2%, or 3% above the national average. In 2010, the latest data for which we have data, this downward trend only accelerated. I forgot to bring my pointer. Do you have a pointer?
Cuban, we forgot.
But you have it there.
Yeah.
That is, you have the figure.
The 4th line from the bottom up.
Yeah, right there.
Right.
By 2010, the figure, the median household Cuban income was about $35,000. That figure was $15,000 below that for the native-born households, and at par with Mexicans. So that is a Cuban average household income had reached parity with that of the Mexican population, which is the largest component of the Hispanic population. So the much talk about Cuban economic advantage relative to other Latin American groups had effectively disappeared. As also seen in the table, the Cuban household poverty rate now exceeds by a full 5 percentage points the native-born average. Put differently, the Cuban population of the United States overall has not advanced economically, but has moved backwards relative to the native-born and to other major immigrant groups. That trend is a direct result of the continuous inflows of refugees of modest human capital and few economic resources from the island. The revolutionary regime that presided over the continuous impoverishment of the country has also impoverished the expatriate community by the simple device of a sustained export of its surplus population. The downward trend should not be assigned exclusively to the policies of the Cuban government, because it is also related to the little support and the little guidance that post-1980 refugees receives from its compatriots in Miami. By failing to involve the new arrivals in the networks of solidarity created by the Cuban enclave economy earlier on, the Miami Cuban elite effectively accelerated its own social and economic bifurcation. That trend becomes more clearly when we examine patterns of entrepreneurship and its consequences in recent years. I'm going to first present you data from the 2000 census, because the 2010 census is strategic for South Florida for two reasons. First, there were still significant numbers of pre-1980 Cubans in the workforce. By now they are dying off, but in 2000 there were still a fairly large number. And second, the Cuban second generation, the US-born Cuban population, were essentially children of these earlier exiles in 2000, which doesn't, by 2010, the picture becomes more mixed. So that the sample for the Miami Fort Lauderdale metropolitan area, coming from the census figures of 2000, numbers about 67,000 adults ages 18 to 65 who earn more than $500 a year in that area. That large sample can be divided in turn, as you can see in the into these categories. Non-Hispanic white, which is the reference category, and then non-Hispanic blacks in that area, and the Cuban population can be divided into pre-1980 migrants, the Mariel and post-Mariel, the second generation, other Hispanics in the area, and other groups. And here we have figures for both personal income and family income, and at the bottom of the table you have the size of the population. And what do we find? Show that is non-Hispanic whites occupy the top of the economic hierarchy in that area with incomes higher than any group. All others had average personal incomes that were significantly lower. But of these, only pre-1980 Cubans, the earlier exiles, and the US Cuban-born second generation, their children, had incomes that exceeded the average for the metropolitan area. The trend is the same if you consider at the bottom of the table family incomes. In this case, only non-Hispanic whites and pre-Mariel Cubans, that is the earlier exiles, had incomes that exceeded $80,000 a year, with the Cuban second generation shy of that amount by little more than $1,000. By contrast, as you can see, refugees arriving during the Mariel exodus and afterwards have not succeeded economically. Their personal and family incomes were lower than that of other Hispanics in the area and not statistically different from non-Hispanic blacks, the bottom ethnic category in this metropolitan area. This next table disaggregates these figures further into the categories of entrepreneurs and wage earners among adult males, because there were not sufficient numbers of adult females entrepreneurs to be able to provide reliable data. Sorry for some of the things that appear have come. So these things always happen in these kinds of slides. There is always some kind of mix-up, but the same ethnic hierarchy that I pointed before holds. Non-Hispanics white at the top, pre-Mariel Cubans close behind, followed by their children, and everyone else below. As repeatedly found by prior studies in sociology and economics, entrepreneurs enjoy a substantial economic advantage in terms of personal and especially family incomes. Entrepreneurs do very, very well. Non-Hispanic whites and pre-1980 Cuban entrepreneurs were the only groups to exceed annual family incomes of over $100,000 in 2000, with the difference between both groups being very small, just shy of 1,000. So they were more or less at par. They were followed at some distance by the second generation, the children of the earlier exiles, and then all others. Differences among wage and salaried workers at the bottom of the table followed exactly the same patterns. That is, in terms of that is the wage salaries are at the bottom, are here at the bottom. That's the average for the metropolitan area for the total MSA for non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks. Oops. And then you can see the others. As you can see at the bottom of the table, the results indicate that Cuban workers who arrived before 1980, at the time that the ethnic enclave had emerged, had done rather well economically, whether they were employed by Cuban firms or not. They were at par with the native born, as you can see at the bottom of the table. The difference is stark with the economic performance of Mariel and post-Mariel refugees whose income levels were at the bottom of the ladder, both for the self-employed and the wage salary in both personal and family incomes. Noteworthy in particular is the poor performance of post-1980 entrepreneurs whose economic rewards were the lowest of all ethnic categories, including African Americans. It is clear from these results that the original advantage conferred on entrepreneurs by the Cuban enclave did not extend to post-1980 arrivals. Part of that disadvantage was due to the recency, a possibility that I will examine next. However, second-generation Cubans entered the local labor force at about the same time as in 1980, as these new recent work arrivals were coming in, and yet their economic performance, both as entrepreneurs and workers, far exceeded that of the Mariel and post-Mariel adult population, by far. That was not because of lack of trying among recent arrivals. This table presents the rates of self-employment and entrepreneurship among all adult males in the Miami metropolitan area in 2000. And two trends, I want to call your attention to two trends in this data. First, pre-Mariel Cubans were the most entrepreneurial of every group, including non-Hispanic white, significantly above non-Hispanic whites, a result that accords with the role of this group as builders of the economic enclave. Second, Mariel and post-Mariel Cubans were also strongly oriented toward entrepreneurship. They also had high rates of self-employment, not significantly different. However, as we just saw in the economic statistics, these efforts at self-employment did not pay off in the same way that they had paid off for earlier Cuban arrivals. This was kind of resourceless entrepreneurship, low capitalized without any kind of contacts with the pre-existing community, and the economic results were what we have just seen. This descriptive data that I have presented to you here can be challenged. It can be challenged by arguing that they essentially reflect differences in levels of human capital, of education, work experience, and so on between different cohorts of the population. And it could be argued that pre-Mariel Cubans simply represent an older and hence more experienced population with higher levels of education, and that is the root cause of their superior economic performance relative to the others. I will restrict the presentation of what comes next, which are a few multivariate regressions to family incomes, because the results, if we were going to present results for personal income, are the same, and family incomes are more important. So this table presents regressions of family incomes in actual dollars. So the figures there are actual dollars, positive or negative, for the adult working population of Miami, Fort Lauderdale, on the standards indicators of income regressions that are done by economists and sociologists all the time. That is human capital, work experience, gender, and so on. The first model presents the effects measured as dummy variables of all ethnic categories. And as you can see, there is a net negative effect in this first column for being Cuban, for the Cuban origin population of close to $10,000. But that is going to change very strong when we look at the second column, when we disaggregate the Cuban population into pre-1980, post-1980, and the second generation. But let's go one thing at a time. There are three main findings that emerge from results of this standard family income with dollars figures. First, that education and work experience, which are the indicators of human capital, have the expected work experience is indexed in this table by age and its and H squared, as is usually done. It's in these regressions. Education and work experience have the expected strong effects on net incomes, as does sex. College and post-college graduates derive an advantage to their education measured in the tens of thousands of dollars relative to high school dropouts, as you can see in terms of the figures for when the less than high school is the reference category. And women suffer the well-known income handicap in South Florida, like in everywhere else, relative to comparable males of similar human capital. Second, after controlling for these predictors, self-employment continues to have a positive and significant effect, as you can see there, about a net effect of over $14,000 advantage in terms of entrepreneurs vis-a-vis the wage population. And third, in the first regression, all ethnic categories earn significantly less than non-Hispanic whites, which is the reference category, as you can see there. More than all the figures are negative. For African Americans, more than $21,000 negative. For Hispanics, $19,000 less than non-Hispanic whites, and so on. And these differences are statistically significant at the highest levels of statistical significance that there can be. But the existing difference for the Cuban population in the first model disappear when you disaggregate the Cuban population into the three categories there. When that happens, pre-Mariel Cubans and the US Cuban-born second generation exhibit incomes that are higher than the reference category of non-Hispanic whites, net of everything else. That is controlling for education, controlling for sex, controlling for self-employment. The net incomes at that year were higher for this particular population. In contrast, post-Mariel Cubans continue to experience a large economic disadvantage, large enough that it is higher than that suffered by any other ethnic category in the Miami metropolitan area, including African Americans. In that category, the annual income gap relative separating Mariel and post-Mariel adult workers from the native Hispanic white, controlling for everything else, for education, age, and so on, is about $23,000, or was about $23,000 a year in 2000. A possible final objection to this finding is that age is not a good indicator of work experience, of US work experience. And you could say that age is not a good indicator because the older groups were already here and they had more work experience. So age may be age lived in Cuba by those who arrive, and it is not a good indicator of this crucial dimension in the human capital function of income. Pre-1980 Cubans may have had much fewer years of experience in the American labor market. So in order to take into account that possibility, we substituted US work experience for age across all ethnic groups. For the that's going to be presented next. For the native born, you measure work experience is measured in a standard ways as age minus education minus 6. That's for the native born. For adult immigrants, in this case all immigrants, it is measured as years since arrival in the United States minus a factor that we can call Y, where Y is 0 for those who arrive after 18 years of age, and is 18 minus the age at arrival for those who arrive as children. In this way, we control and we can measure work experience more or less the same for all. And when that happens, and we substitute actual work experience for age, the results become still more powerful. The Cuban second generation now remains statistically indistinguishable from the reference category of non-Hispanic whites. These are children of earlier exiles. On the other hand, pre-Mariel Cubans males now exceed the pre-1980 group the incomes of non-Hispanic whites by a statistically significant margin. Net of work experience and other control variables, this group of earlier exiles displayed a net income advantage in 2000 of over $4,000 over native whites of comparable human capital and so on. So what happened 10 years later? These are 2000 census figures, because these are the figures in which we had a fairly sizable number of pre-1980 exiles still in the labor force. Where even despite the fact that this group, pre-1980, have been dying off, and the second generation have become more heterogeneous because they are now adult children of immigrants that with Mariel and post-Mariel parents, the trends noted for year 2000 still held. These are the data for 2010. The same rank order among groups is evidence for the adult male population as a whole and for the self-employed. Pre-Mariel Cubans come next to non-Hispanic whites in annual incomes, the difference between the two categories not being statistically significant. The US Cuban second generation follows, and then everyone else. The other category, which is comprised in Miami, in this metropolitan area, mostly by Asians, has a slightly higher self-employment incomes than the Cuban second generation. But despite the additional decade elapsed since 2000, post-Mariel Cubans still trail by a wide margin. Their annual incomes are slightly more than half of those of their older compatriots, and lower than that of African Americans. So they represent the bottom category at present in these metropolitan areas. So clearly, if you want to come to a conclusion of this, clearly the dire economic conditions in Cuba that have been exported to the United States consolidated over time. In the process, the economic profile of the Cuban origin population of the United States has declined steadily from decade to decade. Let me take a couple of minutes to refer briefly to some findings that I think that round the picture. To them, that is, basically they demonstrate that this bifurcation in the first generation travels to their children, travels to the second generation. It is not one that remains with those who were born in Cuba and came to this country, but that it impacts the process of integration in the United States of the Cuban-born second generation. In 2002, the final survey of the Children of Immigrants longitudinal study took place. The study had followed a large representative sample of children of immigrants from early adolescence at average age 14. I am delighted that we have here Professor Lisandro Perez, who led the study in Miami at the time of the SEALs. The SEALs survey was led in Miami by him and his team. That was when the children were average age 14. And then the study followed them 10 years to early adulthood. Included in this sample was a very sizable group of second generation Cubans that were divided in turn by those who attended private bilingual schools in Miami and those who enrolled in public schools in the same city. By age 24, the adaptation process of these youth have begun to harden into a series of objective outcomes likely to determine the future course of their lives. This included educational achievement, occupation and family income, as well as indicators of a downward assimilation course, including premature childbearing in adolescents, unemployment, incidents of arrest, and incarceration. The exiles of the 1960s and 70s created a system of private schools in Miami by transplanting the best-known schools in pre-revolutionary Cuba that were mostly run by religious orders, like the Jesuits, the Marist Brothers, and so on. The purpose of that system was to promote selective acculturation by combining the learning of English and academic subject matters with the preservation of Spanish and key elements of their own culture. Few children of Mariel entrance, of post-Mariel entrance, could attend these schools. And so in our sample, the bifurcation between children attending private schools and those attending public schools serves as a reasonable proxy for the children of earlier exiles, that is the pre-90 groups that created them, and those of later exiles, Mariel and post-Mariel, that were for the most part attending public schools, often in the in the poorer areas of metropolitan Miami. And what do we find? This table summarizes results of the study by average age 24. After we followed the sample here for the principal nationalities that were represented in the South Florida sample of the SEALS study. In every case, results consistently favor the outcomes for the children of pre-1980 exiles. Only 8% of these youth had abandoned their studies with a high school diploma or less, a figure that tripled by that among their public school counterparts. Early school abandonment by public school Cuban youth was higher than among the second generation Haitian and Jamaican, the two poorest immigrant groups in the area. Average family incomes of private school Cubans in 2002 reached over $100,000, the only nationality to surpass six figures. The average among their public school peers was 40% less. Levels of unemployment at average age 24 reflected similar trends, with the public school Cuban rate doubling that of their private school counterparts. Only 3% of the children of earlier exiles had children themselves during adolescence, but the figure was about 6 times that among public school Cubans, where teenage parenthood came close to that to the Nicaraguan figure and exceeded that for other Latin youth in the sample. Our data contains figures on incidents of arrest and incarceration, especially incarceration garnered not from self-reports, but from the Florida Department of Corrections, because being incarcerated for a felony in Florida is public information. So it was possible to, in a sense, match our sample with the data provided by the Florida employee, so as not to depend on self-reports and see what had happened. If some of these kids what had happened by average age 24. Whereas for for young females, it was much more common to have children in early adolescence by young females than males. For males, it was far more common to have experienced incidents of arrest and incarceration. As we see in the figures in the tables, males were indeed far more prone than females to be incarcerated, but among males, there was a significant difference. Only 3% of private school Cubans suffered that fate, a figure almost double by their public school counterparts, which means that 1 in 10 of male children of post-Mariel Cubans was in jail at average age 24, 1 in 10. These differences show that patterns of relative economic advantage and disadvantage endure and carry across generations. As with other immigrant groups, the destiny of the ethnic groups created by new immigrant groups will be determined largely by what happens to the second generation. They are the ones who are going to be here to stay and are going to carry on. In the case of the Cuban population, that destiny is decisively bifurcated. And before Mauricio cuts me off, let me take 1 minute to conclude. The trends noted that I have noted in this data, resurgent transnationalism and the downward economic condition of the Cuban American population overall in the United States are irreversible. Older and richer exiles are dying off, while their children are becoming more and more integrated into the American mainstream. Recent refugees will continue engaging with their families, and they have all the reason to do so, and remitting there as much as they can. These regular transfers, plus the absence of any assistance by established Cuban firms, also ensure that entrepreneurial ventures by the more recent refugees would be poorly capitalized, since the money is being sent continuously abroad, and therefore they will be much less successful. On its part, the Cuban government appears content with the present situation. The aging revolutionary leadership has come to rely on the economic contribution of its young population, not by employing it, but by exporting it. The new facilities for leaving Cuba, coupled with the continuation of quasi-automatic entry into the United States by the Cuban Adjustment Act, can thus translate into a new and large wave of migrants. Unfortunately, their economic prospects would become increasingly bleak as they more and more crowd into the labor market of what is already an impoverished city. There are two schools of thought about consequences of this resurgent Cuban transnationalism for the long-term prospects of the communist regime on the island. On the one hand, Susan Eckstein leans toward predicting significant changes in the island brought about by the influence of the returnees, including greater political openness and some signs of democratization, because the cultural influence of these people is sending remittances and visiting the island frequently. On the other hand, there is another school of thought that envisions the labor exporting policies of the Cuban government as part of an attempt to imitate the Chinese, Vietnamese model of a capitalist economy, of capitalism with a single party state, just as what has happened in China. The Cuban-American political leadership in Miami leans toward the latter interpretation, that what is happening is an evolution toward a Chinese-like type of economy, and there are signs that there may be moves to restrict new entries through the repeal or modification of the Cuban Adjustment Act. To conclude, the end or restriction of future Cuban immigration will not change the present situation, but would merely freeze in place what is already taking place and the lines along which this community has become bifurcated. Overcoming this division would require decisive action by the still numerous and powerful institutions of the earlier exile community. In particular, the children that are now being educated in public schools in Miami require and deserve greater assistance than what has been their due so far. A great deal could indeed be accomplished even now if established exile institutions would veer away from nostalgic rituals, celebrating this and that of old Cuba, and from attempts to reproduce pre-revolutionary culture more than 50 years old already, and pay more attention to what is happening in their midst, what is happening right now in their middle. As with any other immigrant groups, the children are the future. And what happens to the second generation will decisively affect the course of the Cuban-American community in the years to come. While the offspring of the earlier exiles, of the pre-91, have had an open avenue toward educational and occupational success, the growing number of their less fortunate peers in Miami stand in need of decisive support by their co-ethnics, a support that has not been forthcoming so far. No nobler cause could occupy the energies and the resources of Cuban-American economic and civic institutions in the present and in the years to come. Thank you.
But since transnationalism tends to diminish, I'm wondering, with more just general assimilation, will that start to become a factor, or do you foresee that the post-Mariel people will continue to have this kind of engagement with Cuba indefinitely?
Well, it is
Ese está vivo, ¿puedo usar ese o este?
Yeah.
Whatever you prefer.
I think that at present it would tend to last probably longer than what would happen to other groups, precisely because of the very strong expectation of families in the island and kin for this source of support, so that often the identities and the self-esteem of many recent arrivals hinge on this kind of ties. So there are many people who have come that way, that are literally living in Cuba. They work here, but their lives and their families and their significant others are still and that is a process that probably will slow down what you call the inevitable trend toward integration. That the slowing down will continue. It's likely to continue because of the continuous flow from the island. At least as long as the Cuban Adjustment Act remains in place, pretty much guarantees a refreshing of new groups. So if older ones get tired of going back to the island, sending all their money there, and want to take retirement, newer ones are coming to take their place. But I think that what is happening right now in South Florida is a very active transnationalism process that reversed the earlier trend and that shows no signs of ending, whatever. And of course, again, you have these two schools of thought, the Eckstein school that says this is going to open up the island because so many things are coming from the United States. So the status hierarchy in Cuba now depends on how many kin you have sending remittances that would increase the style of life of families relative to what they can get there. I'm the other one who says this will not happen simply. This is a pragmatic adaptation of a wise and wily Cuban leadership to the present situation in order to usher a transition to one-party capitalism.
Well, if I can follow up, that raises another related question, is that in Cuba, clearly this is putting capital and resources in the hands of people with the closest ties to the United States, as opposed to people to the closest ties to the regime, who are probably the least likely to have friends in the United States. So while this policy may make economic sense, it's actually empowering the people that the regime has the least control over. Is this going to be a problem in the...
It should have been more than it is. I think that, this kind of contradiction is clear with the proverbial sense of humor that Cubans have. It's common in Cuba to say that what you needed in the dire economic circumstances of the island is faith. Faith in Spanish is fe, F-E. What you have to do is fe, which is also in Spanish, familiares en el exterior. And you have to have kinship abroad. That's what you have to have in order to do this. Right. And indeed, the ideology of the regime has been completely eroded by this. Although, so that socialism and so on is much less, what remains is nationalism. It's the opposition to the United States because of the presence of the embargo and so on, and the government loses no opportunity to do that, even if the regime is increasingly living off its expatriate the population that it is exporting. But I want to again emphasize that lost in all of this, lost in the fray, are the children. Because that is the general view, and when I gave this lecture in Miami, so the general view of Cuban American kids who are going, what's wrong with that? Is we are doing very well, thank you. We're going to the universities, we're sort of kind of, what's wrong with that? Well, you don't know that what is wrong on the other side is a story, is a fairly dramatic story with heavy indicators of what we have come to call downward assimilation in the poorer areas of Cuban concentration in the Miami area.
We have time for a couple more questions. We will have a reception in the Department of Sociology in the 6th floor, courtesy of Phil Kasnitz and others. And we look forward to seeing you there. Those of you who do not know where sociology is and may wish to attend, you may want to ask outside. We have time for a couple of more questions. Sam at Harvard.
Right. Thank you, Alex, for a very informative and stimulating talk. I really learned a lot.
Sam, you have to speak
Oh,
up. Because
thank you very much. Again, for a very informative talk, and I was really opening my mind to think. Just a couple of points. It seems to me that the extant thesis is not as counterposed to the other one as might appear, because you can have the remittances changing the status hierarchy in Cuba and acting as a stimulant to the formation of a Sino-Vietnamese model in Cuba. With Miami functioning as a sort of hometown, except hometown situated abroad, not in Mariel, to give an example. Now, I want to ask you a question, which is, if you could say a little bit about the occupational profile of the post-Mariel group, particularly if, for example, Cuban women, post-80 Cuban women continue to be as involved in the labor force as they used to be, and what kind of occupations has there been a change in the occupational profile that other than entrepreneurship, like and they continue to be truck drivers, policemen, government workers, etc.
Yeah, well, as the income figures, if we were, instead of presenting tables on income, we presented on occupational status, they would reflect the same pattern of bifurcation. That is essentially a very heavy presence of higher status professional occupation, professional executive among the earlier exiles and their children, and a concentration into primarily manual working class occupations for both men and women in the post-1980 population. Often, their occupational status in the United States is inferior to their educational levels in Cuba, which were relatively high. What is happening is a combination of two things. First, Miami is not well known for being an industrial hub, nor to be a high-tech center of the population. What Miami is construction and tourism. And basically, that is, and then the higher services and so on. But that is failing to establish ties with to sort of gaining the assistance and of the more experienced Cuban entrepreneurs in the area, the bankers, the owners of construction firms, the very clear Cuban-American bourgeoisie that is emerging in this area of millionaires and billionaires, but completely separated from this group. Basically, many of them go to sort of basically survival self-employment. That is, set up a little business with their truck for gardening or home repairs, this kind of thing, or exceeding the types of lower paid employment in the area, in the service sector, the tourism sector, and the construction sector that do not pay that much. So you see a lot of both men and women of post-1980 Mariel working in the hotels, in restaurants, as waiters, and so on, and that's a very common pattern of working lower level service types of jobs, and concentrate physically in the metropolitan area is actually by the book. The Cuban population never goes to Hialeah. That is, they don't know where Hialeah is, and that area is unknown to them, because they concentrate in Kendall, in Coral Gables, in parts of Miami, whereas the new arrivals, the people who come in, almost automatically come to Hialeah and related areas. So even geographically, you see this pattern. You see this pattern of bifurcation, because hey, it's cheaper and so on. And so in a sense, there are two Cuban American communities that exist today side by side, not necessarily conflicting but diverging.
And women continue to participate.
Sam, we have to take more, we only have a couple more. Sam, we'll take 3 questions at a time because we're running out of time. Then we'll see how much more time we have. You had your hand up, and then John.
Just a quick question. What implications do you think this has for the normalization of relations between Cuba?
Implications for normalization, John.
You would think that the political leadership that grew out of the pre-Mariel, the early wave of migration would, to some degree, want to mobilize the post-Mariel voters just to expand their base, and on that basis would want to do something to help these constituencies, but maybe that's not emerging. What prevents the elected officials from responding to the growth of these constituencies?
We had a third question here, and we have, okay, yes,
Okay, why the post-Mariel group is considered only one group?
as opposed to many. Can we
As
take five
opposed
questions?
to, the
Yeah.
pre-Mariel, which only took 20 years, the post-Mariel now is over 30 years.
Very long.
And
Yeah.
why not consider a second group within the post-Mariel?
One more.
One more question, Peter Evans. Josh. Two questions, five questions.
Will you weave the matter of race through this story as well?
Mhm. Okay, very good. Let me get those four, and then if we have time, we'll get to the others.
Okay, go ahead.
That is, clearly, I think that the presence, the growing presence of this population lowers the political profile of the old Cuban population that was completely opposed to lifting the embargo and to normalization of relations. It lowers its political power. At some point, this group that voted in bloc was very important in certain parts of the area. Even in the 2000 presidential election, it was rumored to be very important, and therefore, its complete opposition, even to this day, to anything meaning the lifting of the embargo or normalization with Cuba, at that time carried a great deal of power, of political power. But it's carrying less. It's carrying less and less because this group is dying off, and because others are substituting it into this, that is, the Cuban population is becoming grayish in political terms. That's perhaps one of the reasons why Obama could shake Raúl Castro's hand in South Africa the other day. It's not politically suicidal, even now. It has things, in that sense, are leaning in the direction that I think that the embargo and these kinds of things, the days are counted, because there is no, that is the key group, which was the Cuban American population of Miami, which was completely set up against these views, and that was the key lobby preventing this, is being, in a sense, obliterated by this rising population. I don't know whether that was the intention or not of the Cuban government in allowing more and more people to come, but this is indeed what is happening. Why not recruit post-Mariel voters? Well, so far the problem there, John, is that they are doing, that is their behavior in the sending of remittance and so on, is contrary to the intransigent anti-communist ideology and speech on which the Cuban American political leadership had built its power. So basically, it is working at cross purposes between those two segments of a bifurcated community to go and try to this population that is arriving recently, of recent refugees and so on, see the old-timers are completely lost in time. That is, they don't know what is happening, and certainly are not particularly keen on supporting them. So what has happened is that in addition to that, the more recent post-Mariel arrivals and so on, educated in Cuba, that is raised on the revolutionary, are not very keen, are not familiar with electoral politics in the United States. By and large, their whole preoccupation is with improving their economic situation and improving the situation of their kin and families in the islands. There is not the same sense of civic participation rooted in an electoral politics, because they were not raising. So it will take time for this to arrive. And so far, one of the important things is how politically silent this community had been. the burying of the old anti-communist speech happens by demography, not necessarily by political opposition, but by the weight of numbers. That is, that there are more and more in this situation. And you are absolutely right. That is, I think that we need, that is this, I have given you the presentation of this result with a clear divide in order to make explicit what has happened in terms of and what are the reasons for the decline average economic condition of Cuban families in the United States. But there is a more refined analysis would in a sense separate those cohorts that came in Mariel or immediately after from those who have come later on. It's simply a question of time. Having said that, still it's theoretically important to highlight Mariel because that was a point of inflection. That is what changed things and what, in a sense, separated the community so that what had been until then a very solidary attitude of all of Cuban expatriates toward the newcomers, which sort of helping them, hiring them, protecting them, and so on. I mean, a very solidary attitude, split. Right? That is, they sort of cut off in a very radical way. And certainly, what Peter says, that is one of the issues of Mariel was the issue that was the case that a population that was primarily white, because that was part of the old elite, saw the arrival of a large proportion, not the majority, but large proportion of black Cubans who arrived and that continue to arrive in the future. I think that may have played a role, but I think that was secondary. It was not what caused the bifurcation. The bifurcation was caused by the implosion of the public image of Cubans in the United States that the old elite saw very clearly, and by the presence of people that were taken from the jails and put in the Miami streets of criminals that were taken from, that essentially led to this. And it did not matter where they were white or black. It mattered that is their behavior and the departure that they had. Then came the issue, that is the issue of racism was added to that. That is that the population of Mariel and post-Mariel was increasingly non-white.
In your research, do you weigh in on the question of remittances, the amount of remittances? Do you have data? That's one question.
What?
Do you have data on remittances? But that's just a question whether you do or you don't in your study. You had a, yes. Yeah, this is a very last round of questions, but we have time for, which is not much. Let me go to the sixth floor.
One part of your story is very familiar, which is the first wave of immigrants coming in are then followed by a second wave of a lower class, and they're rejected by the earlier generation. So in the past in New York, you've seen that with Jews from Germany not really welcoming Jews from poorer backgrounds in Russia and Poland and so on. But they're not a nationality group, they're a religious group, and that makes a difference. But we've seen it with Haitians, who the first exiles from Haiti didn't welcome the boat people who came afterwards, in fact turned their backs on them to a great extent. Have they created an enclave or not? It's hard to tell, but it certainly is nowhere similar to the enclave of Cubans. So the question, when you call it a bifurcated enclave, it suggests that there was an enclave that becomes split. But really what you seem to be describing is a second wave of immigrants that hasn't been incorporated into the existing enclave. And I'm wondering why that didn't happen, and whether, I don't think other examples necessarily give you a clue, but the later incoming Cubans weren't incorporated in, you say. And I'm wondering if one of the aspects of incorporation is that the earlier enclave had class divisions, that there were wealthy people who could hire poorer people within the Cuban population, but the protection that they offered was a class relationship in some respects too.
and that built up the Enclave. Is that changing? So that, I guess I'm repeating John's question a little bit, which is, why didn't the newcomers get brought in as workers for those that could offer employment, even amongst the second generation that had high rates of employment?
We have a last question from Lisandro Perez. Are you?
I've been sitting here looking at this tape of the SILS data, and that was only 10 years after the original sample, right? Because it's 2002, is that right?
Yeah, 10 years.
So essentially, when we interviewed these students originally in 1992, these youngsters, they were only, very few of them were actually Maria and post-Maria at that time, but that was 1992. And yet you see this, I mean, the incarceration rate is, this 10 years after we interviewed them in sixth grade, right? Sixth, seventh,
Seven and eight.
7 and 8, that's right. And we interviewed them, and in 10 years after that, they had an incidence of incarceration, which is, and that's not even going deeper into the arrival waves after 92.
Yeah.
We have one last question there, and that's it.
Yeah, the
Make it short, please.
1983 quotation from a Cuban American social worker paired the words homosexuals and delinquents as speaking for themselves as pejoratives. I was wondering, has your research found anything special about the presence of gay persons and of anti-gay prejudice in this community?
That closes the question of the list of questions. Again, we go to sociology after this, explore. And I will ask Alejandro, before we leave, whether these data are available online for people who may want to pursue these questions further.
Okay.
And if we can post them, but I know you have plans for publication, that's a separate question.
That's the fourth question. Well, let me answer the fourth. The data from SILS are publicly available, and they have been used from the children of immigrants longitudinal studies. They have been publicly available for years, and they have been widely used. So people who want to analyze them, the rest of the data that I have presented come from the census. So the public use microdata samples, so they are readily available. On the question from Josh, I'm glad that you raised the issue, because that is really not the story. First of all, the story among the Jews were that indeed the German Jews did not like the newly arriving Yiddish-speaking 2 million new people that came to New York on top of them, and that did something to the old German Jews similar to what I have described here. But eventually, the German Jewish population learned that we are all in the same boat, and the German Jewish population of New York created a vast network of immigrant institutions to assist the integration of their co-ethnics, which were of Russian origin, with the results that we all know. In a sense, the support, the co-ethnic support given by the pre-existing Jewish population to the Russian who arrived at the turn of the 20th century was decisive in sort of assisting them in moving upwards. So that's very different. And actually today we have a contemporary example with the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese who keep coming to the United States have not lost the networks of support of the more established Vietnamese population. And some they have continued, and you can see that even in the average statistics. The average median incomes for the Vietnamese population continue to be higher and higher, and certainly much higher than those of the Cuban population and so on. What happened, and there is another element why the story is different. Even before 1980, the Cuban refugees who were arriving in the late 70s were not part of the elite. There were many lower middle class people of modest origin that were coming into Miami. They were the rich groups had left in the 60s, and these were of more modest origin, but they still have the networks of co-ethnic solidarity available to them. They still could be employed in Cuban firms. They could have access to character loans. They had all these kinds of assistance, so they could become themselves self-employed. So it is not the case that, don't think that Mariel brought about a drastic drop in the human capital of the refugee population community. Not at all. This was about the same in the post-1980 years. What changed was the attitude of the community. That kind of reception that was brought about by a very dramatic decision to sort of create social and physical distance from the new arrivals from Cuba, and that was characterizing the speech. So it was not a question of just a declining gradient of class that led to this, but that is the point of inflection brought about by these historical episodes in America. And that, in a sense, you can contrast what had happened to the Cuban population and its declining economic figures with what happened with the Jewish population, or more presently with the Vietnamese origin population of the United States. And I think that, yes, Lisandro, that's and this we were really surprised. But actually, when we went and did additional research among the second generation kids in Hialeah, especially in the high schools and so on, and that is what happens in Hialeah High and in other areas of impoverished is very similar to what happens in schools of the inner city. So sort of it's an isolated population that very seldom goes out of there. And I can tell you stories that are published. I can give you the references about the wide differences of this. So in a sense, the bifurcation of the first generation became even more dramatic in a second generation, some of which are already well integrated into the American mainstream and becoming more and more Americans, and others who are on the way to become another downtrodden ethnic minority. This is what is happening.
We can continue this conversation in future events. Again, we want to thank Alejandro Cortes